Mahler is a composer of symphonies and songs. And very often those two things absolutely come together. And absolutely the songs influence the symphonies. And so the early symphonies, Symphony number 1, Symphony number 2, Symphony number 3, Symphony number 4, they all have these Knabenwunderhorn, the youth's magic horn. They all have songs from this song cycle, from this book of poetry that Mahler was very much attached to and he loved. And so these songs existed, and how they kind of helped the symphonies come to being, or what was influenced by what, it's actually very interesting if you really plumb the depths of Mahler, because sometimes the songs are interchangeable, and sometimes the song absolutely creates the perfect vehicle and kind of the perfect turn in a symphony, is going from tragic to the uplifting. And so these early symphonies are much influenced by the songs. Later 5, 6, 7 are strictly instrumental. There are no voices involved. Symphony number 8 is the Symphony of 1000, this massive work that has Goethe's Faust, and speaking of everything in the world, I mean, that has every person in the world also. And then the 9th Symphony is very much a farewell. So it's really Mahler, Mahler always went back, and in performances, as he was rehearsing and performing, would go back and revise things, and he was always tinkering. He was never satisfied with how it went. And especially these early symphonies, as performances were more and more common as he became more famous, he would always go back and rethink things and change orchestrations and always consider them kind of a work in progress. But these early 3 symphonies really stand together. There are quotes in the 3rd Symphony of music that happens in the 4th Symphony. So I mean, I think you could almost think of Symphonies 1 through 4 as one ridiculously gigantic symphony. And then 5 kind of takes another turn, again, more instrumental without the kind of vocal approach. And so these early symphonies are very much children of their time, and children, symphonic children that reflect the poetry and really comes right out of the poetry of Das Knabenwunderhorn.
One of the very astute early critics of Mahler's music, Theodor Adorno, he's famous as a philosopher, but he had studied music and wrote quite a bit on music. He wrote a very interesting book on Mahler called Mahler, A Musical Physiognomy, very, very astute book. And he compares Mahler's technique, his symphonic technique, to the technique of the great novel writers of the 19th century. So these big, sprawling novels by Tolstoy or Charles Dickens or Dostoevsky, or these kinds of things. And I think there's something to that, too. So in a novel, those big 19th century novels, what you want to do is sort of capture a world inside the novel, a whole, with many characters and a whole environment that those characters interact within. And that's the way Mahler symphonies feel. Like they're huge. Not all of them are huge. Most of them are, though. And they feel, the 3rd especially, as though he's trying to capture a world, and that's quite extraordinary. It's it's a very special approach to the symphony. As he was working on the 3rd, he saw it as an important breakthrough piece, and he thought he was dealing with the world through his music in ways that he had not been capable of before. During his whole life, his tragically short life, he was extremely busy as a conductor. It's a mature life. Very much in demand, very, you read his schedule, how many pieces he was learning and conducting, mostly opera, overwhelming amount of work. So during the season, he couldn't compose, or very little. He had little notebooks that would jot down ideas and so forth, but his main composing had to take place during the summers. And during the summers, he developed a routine where every morning, the whole morning would be devoted to composing, and he would be alone. His sister had found a place in a small resort 30 miles northeast of Salzburg in the Austrian Alps called Steinbach an Attersee. And he had built for himself a little hut. I'm making it sound really, but a small hut that was secluded from the main building where the family stayed. Not far, but far enough so that it was separate. And that's where he would compose. And so he was surrounded by this beautiful alpine lake and the mountains, and of course the sounds of the birds and all. He was an avid hiker, an avid outdoorsman. He loved nature. He really loved nature. And he, in the first three movements in particular, it's some kind of portrait of this may sound stupid, I don't know, but it's somehow of almost like God in nature, that kind of thing, or it's kind of spiritually suffused nature. Something like that he was getting at. And so I think he felt that he wasn't able to achieve that in the earlier music, and that this was a breakthrough in that respect, in terms of his own imaginative place in the world, what he was trying to achieve, what he was trying to utter through his music. So it's interesting. The first movement is this biggest sprawling movement, the Third Symphony. Begins with a fanfare in the French horns. He's got 8 horns and all in unison, and they play this fanfare. The audience is going to, you'll hear it's right out front. And in his own personal notes, he called it Weckruf, which means it's like reveille. It's the wake-up call. But in his own notes about that, he talked about Pan awakening, and he thought of Pan as the god of nature. So it's like the beginning of the world, and nature comes into being.
It's the great privilege of the singer to work with text. I don't know many singers worth their salt who aren't totally compelled by meaning, story, and communication. I can't fathom choosing this very difficult path if that were not paramount. This, of course, is no exception, because Mahler had extraordinary literary taste, literary sensibility, and was a poet himself. In this case, in Mahler 3, he chose for 1 hour into the symphony to bring in the human voice, first in the form of the soloist, with the Nietzsche text. It is followed, completely attached, flows right into a movement with an entirely different kind of text from Das Knabenwunderhorn. So the first text, where the soloist comes in, is like this primordial incantation, almost like a whisper from the music of the spheres. It's a universal incantation. Oh man, oh mensch. So right away, we know we're dealing with something profound, not at all on the surface. The first moment of the human voice is from deep, deep, deep within. I think what Nietzsche and Mahler were looking for was a universal consciousness, an ancient universal consciousness. So he starts with that, and that whole fourth movement has that kind of longing and that kind of text. The other major points of that text are that pain is deep and joy is deeper. This says kind of everything. That's the human condition, and yet Nietzsche and of course Mahler are also keeping the human condition within the context of the universe. The second text is remarkably contrasting. It's a biblical Christian scene, and it's redemption and salvation through grace. It's really the soloist is saying, how can I be joyful when I have sinned? And the choir says, if you've sinned, love God and you'll go to heaven. So if you juxtapose those two texts, they're not really espousing philosophies. They're almost impressionistic moments of human history and our need to explain our existence and to, I would say, mollify the pain of our existence.
The fourth movement sets a poem by the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. And it's a very dark poem. and it's a very dark movement. I'll talk about the sequence of the movements, and I'll come back to this. But it's a very dark poem and a very dark movement, and there you feel that something else is going on. It's not this profusion of nature images. It's a more internalized, subjective human space as a human being tries to find his or her place in the world. And it's a very sorrowful, profound, slow movement. And then that's followed immediately by this chorus that's this kind of children's beggar song with a lot of ringing of bells and kind of stuff that on the surface of it seems joyous, but you don't know how to take it. And then the final movement is, well, he called it, I forget the word that he used, but love. He said it was depicting love. I think he means spiritual love. I don't know for sure, but it starts as almost like a hymn in the strings, and then gradually adds woodwinds and then brass, and ends up with this glorious final, section.
Mahler in the last movement is nothing less than what love tells me, and it's not fast, it's not peppy, it is this most gorgeous 25-minute, something like that, that's certainly around there, slow music that is like the most beautiful love song that starts out intimately and just gets deeper and deeper. It takes paths, it goes to the tragic, and certainly it's not just beauty, 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 but it's very intense. But the way the ending builds, after we've kind of lived through tragedy, we come back to this beautiful, stately tune, and just the way things build and build and build and build. And when the orchestra is playing as fully and deeply as you think it possibly can, Mahler requires you to go even fuller and deeper. And so it's just perfectly orchestrated and perfectly paced. And this is why, this last movement is one of those movements where if you've never experienced this piece before, I have goosebumps just talking about it. If you've never experienced this piece before, you're going to come away just thinking you'll be stunned. You'll be stunned because it is so beautiful and it's so profound, and Mahler absolutely succeeds in expressing the world.
The piece was essentially done at the end of 1886. Mahler, like I said earlier, was known mostly in his lifetime as a great conductor, and that's what he was in demand. Critics and audiences were somewhat cynical about his abilities as a composer. And he'd had some bad experiences. The piece was partially premiered. 3 of the 6 movements were performed in 1897, so just a year after its completion. Felix Weingartner, important conductor of the period, did that. I think it was in Berlin, and it got hideous reviews. They called Mahler a maniac and a megalomaniac, and what kind of music is this, and blah, blah, blah. So you can imagine he was a little apprehensive about, and that was without the big first movement. So, but he of course wanted to get it out there and perform it. His more successful colleague, also successful as a conductor, but also more successful at the time, at least as a composer. He's since been eclipsed by Mahler, but at the time he was much more successful. Richard Strauss helped to set up the logistics and the wherewithal because this needs a huge orchestra, big forces. And the premiere was to take place in a small town in Germany in 1902, with expert musicians brought in from some of the best orchestras. And Mahler, as was typical for Mahler, insisted on many more rehearsals than would normally be given to a piece. And evidently by the time it was premiered, it was finally honed, and played, you know, really beautifully. And it was a triumph. It was actually his first real, unequivocal triumph as a composer. The audiences absolutely loved the piece. The press was superb. All the critics were saying, wow, kind of things. What I've read, and I don't know if I read anything, I haven't seen anything negative said about that premiere.